Employment law. We will be exploring the employment relationship in this video. For Chapter 1, you're going to need to define the employment relationship, along with distinguish between an employee and an independent contractor, understand the duties of an employer and the worker, and appreciate the types of authority given to the worker. Further, you're going to know the parameters of a non-compete and non-disclosure agreement and when each is enforceable. Determine when an employee's actions occurred within the scope of employment, and identify situations that could lead to potential liability involving contract disputes and the torts of assault, battery, defamation, and invasion of privacy. Independent contractor is the next area we're going to look at. An independent contractor is an individual hired by an employer to perform a specific task. The employer has no control over the methods used by the independent contractor. The following are among those who act independently of an employer. These are not limited to this list, but here are a few to think about. Electricians, carpenters, plumbers, television repair persons, and automobile mechanics. Elements of an employment contract. Employment contracts are personal service contracts in which an individual is employed on a salary basis, as well as contracts with independent contractors in which performance is on an hourly or per case basis. Generally, employment contractors are not required to be in writing because they are indefinite in nature. Duty of loyalty. An employee has a duty to inform, obey instructions, and to protect confidential information of their employer. An employee or independent contractor has a duty to disclose all pertinent information he or she learns of that will affect the employer, the employer's business, or the task at hand. Duty to act in good faith. An employee or independent contractor has an obligation to perform all duties in good faith. He or she must carry out the task assigned by using reasonable skill and care. The employee or independent contractor has a further duty to follow the employer's instructions and not to exceed the authority delegated to him or her. Duty to account. An employee or independent contractor has a duty to account for all compensations received, including kickbacks. Upon the employer's request, an employee of an independent contractor must make a full disclosure, known as an accounting, of all receipts and expenditures. Duty to account continues. The employee or independent contractor must non-commingle funds, but rather keep the employer's funds separate from their own. Further, an employee or independent contractor must not use the employer's funds for his or her own purposes. Duty to compensate. An employer has a duty to compensate the employee or independent contractor for the work performed. An employee of an independent contractor will be entitled to the amount agreed upon in the contract. Otherwise, they will be entitled to the reasonable value of the services rendered. Duty to maintain safe working conditions. The maintenance of safe working conditions is another obligation placed on the employer. Any tools or equipment furnished to the employee must be in proper working order. Otherwise, the employer may be liable for the harm resulting to the employee under the Occupational Safety and Health Act Administration, and we will be looking at the OSH Act also later in the term. Duty to maintain safe working conditions. If an employee is injured during the scope of employment, an employee will be covered under the workers' compensation laws. The scope of employment means the worker is on the job. Non-compete agreement. A non-compete agreement is a contract Act, wherein the employers provide employment or severance package. What this means is that you did not have the non-compete until you were being let go upon termination. Sometimes when you enter into a job, you will have to sign a non-compete agreement at the beginning, and other times you may have to sign one upon termination. This is an employee's promise not to work for a competitor or open a competing business within the geographic area in which the employer transacts business for a reasonable length of time. Non-disclosure agreements. An employer's sale or use of trade secrets, confidential information, and/or work in progress that has commercial value or will result in harm of an employer may be restricted in a non-disclosure agreement. Courts will enjoin an employee where the employer is protecting its legitimate business. Now we're going to move on to what is an injunction. An injunction is an equitable remedy that prevents a party breaching a contract from rendering the same performance elsewhere. An injunction is personal in nature and negative in effect, in that it precludes a person from performing certain acts. However, because the breaching party cannot be compelled to perform a certain act, an injunction can prohibit the party from performing the same act elsewhere. Contractual conditions. A condition occurs when the party's contractual duties are contingent upon the occurrence of a future event. Parties must expressly agree when making the contract if they are conditioning their obligations on the occurrence of a particular event. Tort liability. An employer is liable for any tort committed by his or her employee if the tort is committed within the scope of employment, that is, if it is related to the business at hand. A tort is a private wrong, as opposed to a crime, which is a public wrong and is a wrong committed against the public at large. Tort liability is contained here. So, however, an employer is not liable for the torts of an independent contractor, even if the torts are committed during the scope of the employment, because the employer has no control over the work of an independent contractor. Human resource rights. These are very important facts to think about, since it is a human resource and law course. So as we begin it, please think about these as the week advances. Develop an understanding of the implementation of economic realities as it relates to the distinction between employees and independent contractors. Discern what kind of authority employees should have and how much authority should be given to them. Reprimand employees if they exceed the authority given to them. Indoctrinate employees concerning the loyalty owed to the employer and their need to always act in the best interest of the company. Implore employees to act in good faith, give their best effort, and carry out their jobs in a responsible manner. Of course, compensate employees fairly and be concerned about their workplace safety. Among other benefits, this will enhance employee morale. Understand when an employee's actions occur within the scope of employment. Appreciate the torts of defamation, invasion of privacy, and interference with business relations when speaking to others about employees. Remember that contracts are binding and lawsuits are filed for breach of contracts. Minimize tort liability by emphasizing to employees that they should never assault, defame, harass, inflict emotional distress, or interfere with the business relations of others. The key here to look at as we start our summary is to a successful business is the existence of a positive relationship between the employers and the employees. The most valuable resource a company has are the employees, and that's why we need to look at these important issues this week. Employers are confronted with issues concerning employees' authority, duties, compensation, and liability. Employers must be concerned and look and focus on employees and their duties and their authority in a clear and concise manner. Employers must fairly compensate their workers. Employers should limit their liability by adequately educating and training their employees with regard to specific torts and breach of contract. Adopting the concept of scope of employment to the business will clearly define an employer's liability for torts and breaches of contracts. A good understanding of the appropriate time to employ a covenant not to complete is an employment contract must be firm and is essential to the company that is hiring the employee. Finally, the distinction between an employee and an independent contractor has to be defined. Courts employ an economic realities test to determine the extent of control the employer has over the behavior and compensation of a worker and whether the relationship is considered a permanent one. We are wrapping up here. This is the last slide, and you just need to keep and think about human resources in the law this week and about employment laws, how they concern different types of employee-employer relationships.